There is a specific feeling that anxious attachment produces at the beginning of a relationship. A feeling so intense, so immediate, so unlike anything else that people who experience it consistently describe it the same way. Like coming home. Like finally. Like this person is the one I have been looking for. And the certainty is not gradual, not built through time and evidence and the slow accumulation of trust, but immediate, total, and overwhelming. The person across from you feels known before being known. The connection feels inevitable. The intensity feels like proof. And the more unavailable, the more unpredictable, the more emotionally inaccessible that person turns out to be, the stronger the feeling becomes. Because here is what anxious attachment knows and the conscious mind does not. This is not new. This is the oldest feeling there is. Jung spent his career mapping the way the unconscious organizes present experience around templates formed in the past. The way a psyche shaped by early relational experiences will recognize and be drawn toward situations that replicate the emotional texture of those experiences, not because they are good, but because they are known. Anxious attachment is one of the clearest illustrations of this principle. The person with anxious attachment is not drawn to unavailable partners because they enjoy suffering. They are drawn to them because the specific emotional experience of pursuing someone who is inconsistently available, the hypervigilance, the reading of signals, the oscillation between closeness and distance, the relief of reconnection after withdrawal, is the emotional landscape they learn to navigate first. It is the landscape that feels, at the deepest level, like reality, the counterintuitive truth that Jung's framework produces about anxious attachment, and this is the turn that changes everything, is that the problem is not that the pattern feels wrong. The problem is that it feels exactly right. The stable, available, consistently present partner who offers what the anxious attachment system actually needs feels not like coming home, but like something slightly off, slightly boring, slightly unreal, slightly insufficient in its very safety. The nervous system that was calibrated to function in an environment of emotional inconsistency does not experience consistent love as love in the full register. It experiences it as something milder, something that lacks the charge. And the charge, the anxiety, the longing, the chase, is what was learned very early to confuse with depth. This video is a deep dive into the psychology of anxious attachment through the lens of Jung. Not primarily as a description of the pattern, which most people who have it already recognize, but as an excavation of its origins, its unconscious logic, and the specific psychological work that is required to develop a genuine capacity for the kind of relationship that anxious attachment consistently sabotages. This is not a video about how to fix your attachment style in 30 days. It is about understanding, at the level where the pattern actually lives, why it is so extraordinarily resistant to change, and what genuine change actually requires. Chapter 2. Where the template was built. Anxious attachment does not develop in response to consistently bad parenting. It develops in response to inconsistent parenting, and this distinction is crucial. The child whose primary caregiver was consistently warm, consistently available, consistently responsive learned, through the reliable repetition of that experience, that the world is predictable and that other people can be trusted. The child whose primary caregiver was consistently cold or absent learned something different but still coherent, a model of relationship organized around distance and self-sufficiency. But the child whose primary caregiver was sometimes warm and sometimes withdrawn, sometimes present and sometimes absent, sometimes attuned and sometimes inexplicably unreachable. This child learned something that neither of the other two learned, that love is fundamentally unpredictable, and that the job of the self is to monitor the environment constantly for signals of its availability. Picture a specific child. She is 4 years old, and her mother is having a good day. The warmth is real, the attention is full. The connection is exactly what a child needs it to be. The child relaxes into it, completely, trustingly, with the full openness that children bring to moments of genuine care. 2 days later, for reasons the child cannot understand and that have nothing to do with her, the mother's own unprocessed grief, Her anxiety, her relationship with her own history, the warmth is gone. The same child approaching with the same openness receives something cooler, more distracted, less present. She registers this, not consciously, not with words, but completely. And she begins the work that will organize her relational psychology for decades, trying to understand what changed, what she did, what she can do differently to bring the warmth back. Jung would locate this early experience at the foundation of what he called the mother complex, the constellation of feelings, expectations, and relational strategies organized around the primary experience of being cared for. When the mother complex is formed in the context of consistent care, it provides a stable foundation, an internal working model of relationship as a place of reliable nourishment. When it is formed in the context of inconsistent care, it provides something different, an internal working model organized around the management of uncertainty, the reading of emotional weather, the deployment of strategies to maintain connection with a source that cannot be fully trusted to remain available. This model does not stay in the past. It goes forward, into every subsequent relationship where the emotional stakes are high enough to activate it. The specific wound that produces anxious attachment is not the experience of being unloved. It is the experience of being loved inconsistently, of having love be real and present, and then absent without clear reason, of having the source of nourishment be simultaneously the source of uncertainty. This wound is, in many ways, more difficult to process than the wound of consistent absence, because it cannot be clearly named or clearly mourned. The parent was loving. The parent was also sometimes not. Both things are true, and the complexity of that truth makes it genuinely difficult to metabolize. What gets metabolized instead is the strategy, the hypervigilance, the constant monitoring, the desperate attempt to secure what is real but unreliable, which then becomes the template for all subsequent intimate relationships. Chapter 3. The unconscious selection. The person with anxious attachment does not consciously choose unavailable partners. From the inside, the experience is of falling, of being moved towards someone by a force that bypasses rational evaluation entirely. But Jung's understanding of the unconscious as an active agent, as a dimension of the psyche that has its own goals and its own methods of pursuing them, offers a more precise account of what is actually happening. The unconscious is not making an error when it selects for unavailability. It is executing a program that was written in early childhood. Find the emotional landscape that is known. Find the relational dynamic that matches the internal template. Find the person who will recreate the conditions in which the original work, the work of securing inconsistent love, was first learned. Here is what the unconscious selection actually feels like from the inside. And this is the part that makes it so difficult to interrupt. Picture 2 first dates. The first person is warm, engaged, asks genuine questions, makes steady eye contact, texts back the same evening to say they had a good time. The second person is interesting, slightly elusive, occasionally fully present and occasionally somewhere else, leaves a reply that could mean several things. The first date produces a pleasant evening and a mild sense of connection. The second produces something that keeps the anxiously attached person up until 2 in the morning, turning the conversation over, looking for meaning in the ambiguity, feeling more alive in the uncertainty than they felt in the entire warmth of the first encounter. The available person and the unavailable person do not produce the same feeling, not even close. And the feeling that the unavailable person produces, the charge, the pull, the specific aliveness of uncertainty, is what the anxiously attached nervous system has been calibrated since childhood to interpret as significance, as depth, as the real thing. The counterintuitive implication of this, and it is one that most people with anxious attachment resist deeply, is that the intensity of the feeling at the beginning of a relationship is not a reliable indicator of the relationship's potential. It is instead a fairly reliable indicator of pattern recognition. The more intensely familiar the emotional texture of the new person feels, the more the dynamic replicates the original template, the more powerfully the unconscious registers it as significant. This means that the relationships that feel most like destiny are frequently the ones most organized around the original wound, and the relationships with the most actual potential the ones with people who are genuinely available, genuinely consistent, genuinely capable of the kind of love that anxious attachment needs, are the ones that tend to be dismissed early for lacking the charge. Jung would describe this process as projection, the unconscious casting of inner images onto outer people. The anxiously attached person is not simply falling for the unavailable partner. They are projecting onto that partner the image of the original inconsistent caregiver, and then relating to the projection rather than to the actual person. This is why the relationship tends to follow a predictable arc, regardless of the specific individuals involved. The initial intensity, the attempt to secure connection, the withdrawal of the unavailable partner, the escalation of pursuit, the brief reconnection that feels like confirmation, the next withdrawal. The script is not written by the current relationship. It was written decades earlier. The current partner is simply the latest actor cast in a role that has been playing since childhood. Chapter 4. The hypervigilance that never rests. One of the least discussed but most exhausting features of anxious attachment is the hypervigilance, the continuous automatic monitoring of the relational environment for signals of the partner's availability, mood, and level of engagement. This monitoring is not chosen. It is not a habit that can be broken by deciding to stop. It is a survival strategy that was developed in an environment where the emotional weather changed without warning, and where the consequences of not noticing the change in time were significant. The child who learned to read the room, to notice the subtle shift in the caregiver's affect, the slight withdrawal of warmth, the change in tone that preceded unavailability, developed a perceptual sensitivity that was genuinely adaptive in that environment. In adult intimate relationships, that same sensitivity becomes a source of chronic exhaustion and chronic misreading. Picture this precisely. A person with anxious attachment sends a message to their partner and the reply takes 40 minutes longer than usual. In the 40 minutes before the reply arrives, the following has happened. The person has reviewed the last conversation for anything that might have caused offense, has considered several possible interpretations of the delay, has noticed a physical tightening in their chest that they are managing by staying busy, has drafted and deleted 2 follow-up messages, and has arrived at a low-level but persistent conviction that something is wrong, a conviction that will not be fully resolved by the reply when it arrives, because the anxiety is not really about the message. The anxiety is about the fundamental question that anxious attachment is always asking. Am I still safe? Is the connection still there? Has the warmth withdrawn? The hypervigilance produces a specific distortion in perception that Jung would recognize as the operation of the complex, the tendency of the emotionally charged psychological structure to filter incoming information in ways that confirm its existing template. The anxiously attached person does not experience their partner's normal variation in availability, the days they are more distracted, more tired, more internally occupied, as normal human variation. They experience it as signal, as the beginning of withdrawal, as evidence of the pattern they have been monitoring for. And this misreading, the interpretation of ordinary distance as relational danger, tends to produce the very responses that make the feared withdrawal more likely. The pursuit that pushes the avoidant partner further away. The emotional escalation that makes the relationship feel unsafe for someone who needs space. The self-fulfilling prophecy of the attachment wound. There is something important that the hypervigilance is protecting, and understanding this is the beginning of being able to work with it rather than simply against it. The constant monitoring is not irrational. It was the appropriate response to an environment where love was genuinely unreliable, and where the early warning system was genuinely useful. What makes it costly in adult relationships is not that it was wrong then, it was right then. It is that it is still running now, in an environment that is different, interpreting present signals through a past template, responding to a danger that may no longer exist with the full force of the system that was built to manage it when it did. Chapter 5. Why Stable Love Feels Wrong. This is the chapter that people with anxious attachment tend to find most uncomfortable, because it names something that is rarely said clearly, and that most people who experience it have significant shame about. Stable love feels wrong. Not in every moment, not all the time, but in a way that is consistent and that has no rational justification. The partner who is reliably present produces, after the initial relief of their consistency, a subtle restlessness. The relationship that has no drama, no chase, no oscillation between closeness and withdrawal produces, after a time, a quality of flatness that is difficult to distinguish from incompatibility. The person who is genuinely available, who responds quickly, who is transparent about their feelings, who does not withdraw, can begin to feel, paradoxically, slightly suffocating in their very presence. Jung would understand this as the nervous system's fidelity to its original template. The template was built in conditions of emotional inconsistency, and it was calibrated, literally at the neurological level, to function optimally in those conditions. Consistent availability does not produce the activation that the template requires to feel like a real relationship is happening. The absence of anxiety does not register as peace. It registers as the absence of something that should be there, as a kind of emotional flatness that the anxiously attached person interprets as evidence that the connection is not as deep as it should be, that the feeling is not as strong as it was with the unavailable person, that this relationship, however good on paper, is somehow not the right one. Here is the counterintuitive truth that most therapeutic approaches to anxious attachment eventually arrive at. The feeling of something being missing in a stable relationship is not a signal about the relationship. It is a signal about the template. The flatness is not the absence of love, it is the absence of anxiety. And for a nervous system that learned to experience anxiety and love as inseparable, that learned in the most formative period of its development, that love comes mixed with uncertainty, the absence of anxiety genuinely does feel like the absence of something. The work is not to find a relationship that produces the charge. The work is to learn to recognize what the charge actually is, and to develop enough tolerance for the absence of it to allow a genuinely different kind of connection to register as real. This is one of the most precise and most painful aspects of anxious attachment, the very thing that would heal it. Consistent, reliable, available love is the thing that the nervous system is least equipped to receive. Not because the person doesn't want it. They want it desperately, but wanting it and being able to metabolize it when it arrives are two very different capacities. And the gap between them, the gap between the conscious longing for stable love and the unconscious inability to experience it as satisfying, is where the pattern lives and where the work needs to happen. It is also, not coincidentally, precisely the gap that makes the avoidant partner so extraordinarily difficult to leave, because the avoidant partner, by never being fully available, never requires the anxiously attached person to confront that gap directly. Chapter 6. The Dance with the Avoidant. Anxious attachment does not exist in isolation. It exists in relationship. And the relationship it most consistently finds itself in is with avoidant attachment. This pairing is so common and so predictable that attachment researchers have studied it extensively, but Jung would have recognized it immediately as the operation of complementary unconscious needs. The anxiously attached person needs, at an unconscious level, the proximity and reassurance that the avoidant partner withholds. The avoidant partner needs, at an unconscious level, the distance and autonomy that the anxiously attached person's pursuit threatens. Each activates the other's core wound. Each, in trying to manage their own anxiety, produces the exact conditions that escalate the others. The specific dynamic plays out with a consistency that people who have lived it describe as both inevitable and baffling. The anxiously attached person moves toward connection. The avoidant partner, feeling the approach as pressure, creates distance. The anxiously attached person, reading the distance as the signal they have been monitoring for, intensifies the pursuit. The avoidant partner, now experiencing genuine overwhelm, withdraws further. At some point, one of two things happens. The avoidant partner withdraws enough that the anxiously attached person gives up and pulls back, at which point the avoidant partner, no longer feeling pursued, moves toward reconnection, which reactivates the anxious attachment and begins the cycle again. Or the relationship ends, and both people carry the wound forward into the next iteration. Picture the specific moment that is the emotional center of this dynamic. The anxiously attached person has been in withdrawal mode for 3 days, has pulled back, has gone quiet, has decided they are done. And then the avoidant partner texts. Something small, something that would mean nothing in a different context. But in this context, after 3 days of silence, it means everything. The anxiously attached person feels the charge return, the aliveness, the pull, the sense that this is real after all, and the withdrawal collapses. Not because anything has changed in the relationship, because the pattern has been fed, because the nervous system has received the signal it was waiting for and has returned to its baseline orientation, pursuing the connection that is inconsistently available. What Jung would add to the attachment theory understanding of this dynamic is the dimension of projection. The avoidant partner is not only activating the anxiously attached person's wound, they are carrying something that the anxiously attached person has projected onto them. Specifically, the image of the original inconsistent caregiver, with all the emotional charge that image carries. This is why leaving the avoidant partner is so much harder than the rational mind suggests it should be. It is not only the current relationship that is being left, it is the original relationship, the first inconsistent love, that is being grieved. And that grief is profound and it is old and it is not resolved by ending the current relationship. It is only resolved by being felt. Chapter 7. The work of earned security. Attachment researchers use a term, earned security, that is worth understanding precisely because it names something that anxious attachment theory sometimes obscures. The fact that attachment patterns can change. Not quickly, not easily, not by deciding to be different, but through a specific kind of relational and psychological work that gradually builds what the original environment could not provide, a stable internal experience of being fundamentally lovable and of relationships as fundamentally safe. Earned security is not the same as the secure attachment that develops naturally from a consistently attuned early environment. It is harder won, more consciously constructed, and in some ways more resilient for having been built deliberately rather than simply absorbed. The first element of the work is the development of what Jung would call self-knowledge about the pattern, not just intellectual recognition, but the visceral moment-to-moment awareness of the pattern as it operates. This means learning to recognize, in real time rather than retrospect, when the hypervigilance is activated. When the chest tightens before the partner's reply arrives. When the interpretation of ordinary distance is becoming threat. When the pull toward the unavailable person is the pattern speaking rather than genuine discernment. This recognition, felt in the body, not just understood in the mind, is the beginning of the gap that makes choice possible. Not the absence of the pattern, but the capacity to see it operating before it has already determined the response. The second element is the development of tolerance for the absence of the charge, the capacity to stay in a relationship that feels safe without interpreting the safety as insufficiency. This is genuinely difficult work for a nervous system that learned to experience love and anxiety as inseparable. It involves, at a practical level, repeatedly choosing to stay present in the stable relationship when the restlessness arises, not because the restlessness is wrong, but because it is information about the template rather than about the relationship. Each time the person stays, each time they allow the safety to exist without converting it into evidence of inadequacy, the nervous system receives a small increment of new experience. Not dramatic, not transformative in a single moment, but cumulative over time, in the direction of a different baseline. The third element, the one Jung would consider most essential, is the grief work. The anxious attachment pattern was built around a wound, the wound of love that was real and inconsistent. That wound was never fully mourned, because the child who experienced it was not equipped to mourn it, and the adult has been managing it rather than feeling it ever since. What this grief actually feels like when it finally surfaces is not dramatic. It tends to arrive quietly, in a moment alone, or in a therapy session, or sometimes in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, as a sadness that is older than any current situation warrants. A sadness for the child who kept trying, who woke up every morning and tried again to read the signals correctly, to be what was needed, to secure the warmth that kept withdrawing. Who deserved consistency and received uncertainty instead, and who concluded in the only way a child can conclude that the uncertainty was somehow the answer to who they were. Allowing that grief, sitting with it rather than immediately converting it into analysis or action, is the most direct path into the wound that the pattern was built to manage, and it is the only path that leads somewhere genuinely different. Chapter 8. The relationship that doesn't feel like home. The relationship that anxious attachment needs is not the relationship that anxious attachment wants. This is the central paradox of the pattern, and the central truth that the work is aimed at resolving. What the pattern wants is the charge, the intensity, the familiar oscillation between closeness and withdrawal that the nervous system was calibrated to navigate. What the person needs is something that produces none of that. A relationship whose primary quality is not intensity, but steadiness, not drama, but presence, not the relief of reconnection after withdrawal, but the quiet continuity of consistent availability. And the challenge is that this relationship, when it arrives, does not initially feel like love in the full register that the pattern has defined as real. Jung would say that the capacity to receive this kind of relationship, to allow consistent love to register as significant rather than insufficient, is itself a developmental achievement. It is not given. It is not arrived at by simply deciding to value stability over intensity. It is built, slowly, through the accumulation of experiences that gradually teach the nervous system a truth it was never taught in its original environment. That safety is not the absence of love. That consistency is not the absence of depth. That the relationship that doesn't keep you anxious is not the relationship that doesn't matter. This teaching happens in relationship, in the specific repeated experience of being met consistently by someone who does not withdraw, who does not become unavailable, who continues to show up even when showing up is not dramatic. There is a specific moment that people who have done this work describe, a moment that tends to arrive quietly, without announcement, and that is easily missed if you are still waiting for the charge. It is the moment when you notice that you feel safe, not relieved after anxiety, safe, not connected after disconnection, simply present with another person in a way that does not require management or monitoring or the reading of signals. This moment does not feel like coming home in the way that anxious attachment has defined home. It feels like something new, like arriving somewhere you have not been before, that does not yet have the full weight of familiarity, but that has something the familiar places never had. Room to breathe, room to be seen without the performance that the pattern required. If you recognized your pattern in this video, if the description of the charge, the familiar pull toward unavailability, the flatness of stable love, has the quality of something lived rather than merely observed, then you already know the most important thing. The pattern is not who you are. It is what you learned. And what was learned in relationship can be unlearned in relationship, not by finding the right person to complete you, but by doing the work that gradually makes you available for a different kind of connection. The relationship that doesn't feel like home at first. The one that feels instead like something you have been building toward without knowing it. The one that, given enough time and enough presence, might become something the old home never was. Genuinely yours.